Hi, my name is Sandra Cisneros. I'm a writer. My mother passed away in November 1st, actually, on one of the Days of the Dead in 2007. And Cesario Moreno from the National Museum of Mexican Art invited me to participate the following Days of the Dead and install an altar, but I was still too fresh from the wound of losing my mom. And he invited me again in 2009. And so I created a smaller version of the altar you see here. It's called a room of her own. And my mom never had a room of her own until after she had all of us 7 children and after her husband died. So she only had a room of her own for the last 10 years of her life. And it was very special to her. I tried to recreate it here. There are some things that are actually from her room and some things that are recreations of her room. I felt that my mom, her spirit was something very different than the woman I knew. I was in the room when she passed away, and I got to experience what her spirit felt like when it was leaving the body. And I felt it in the room before it disappeared. It was an incredible experience that I've written about. And what it made me realize was that I really didn't know my mom. I knew my mother, but I didn't know who she was before she had all of the 7 children, who she was before she married. And I didn't know who she wanted to become and the disappointment that she felt because she didn't reach those dreams. So I tried to do that in this altar, to think about who my mom was before she met me, before she met my father. And in the back wall, all of those names that are there, starting with her name, Elvira Cordero Cisneros, and then Maria Romualdo Felipe Anguiano, her mom, and her mom's mom, and like that. I put all the names of my women ancestors because I feel as if we don't even remember their name one generation away. You know, all of the mothers and grandmothers, once they marry, they lose their names and we don't even know who they are. So I did a genealogical research for getting the names of my mother's lineage and the women in her family. In the beginning, the first altar didn't have all these names. It had a text. And this time the text was names of the women that get forgotten even within a generation. In the left-hand side is a copy of an embroidered little burro that my great grandmother embroidered from my mother, left to my mother. It's right on the center panel next to a photo of my mom. I tried to do the 4 directions here with photos of my mom when she was young, and then one later when she's older. But the one on the left is a little burro with her initials on it, EC, and that was embroidered by her grandmother. So I wanted to include work that was done by my women ancestors. And the one on the bottom that says Suspiro por ti, my mother did, and she signed it. And so I tried to, the only inheritance I have from my women ancestors, because they were poor women, there's a little mantelitos and embroidered cloths and pillows. And my mom, who could draw and sing and was very talented, only got to express her art through domestic projects like, you know, paint by numbers or drawing with us as children. And there's a photo of her on the right when she's older with a tomato from her garden, her gardening. And I just felt like my mom could have been so many things, but she didn't have the education or the opportunities I had, but she made sure that I had them. So this was a homenaje to my mom and her own creativity and her own dreams. On the right of this panel, there's clothing. Yeah, that's her blouse from when she was a young single woman. And that's her fancy slip. And she gave them to me. I used to wear them when I was skinny. And I hung them up because I just thought they were so pretty, and they kind of make a ghost of, like, my dress hangs there, kind of an homenaje to Frida too. And on the other side, opposite, is my mother's rebozo. and a blouse that she had also from Mexico. I used to wear that blouse, and again, when I was skinny, and I put it up there, and it was horrible. So I don't know how she got it or who gave it to her. The Virgen de Guadalupe hanging on the left side in the scarf was a souvenir that her sister and I don't know who went with her sister to Mexico. Her mom never went back, but they brought back this souvenir for her mom, because her mom was very devoted to the Virgen de Guadalupe, whereas my mom was not. But it skipped a generation, and I'm a devotee. So I wanted this scarf that used to belong to my mother's mother to be here, to connect her with her women of her family. My grandmother also was a believer in the Santo Niño de Atocha, and that's why I have the Santo Niño de Atocha on a little shelf here. And I have a photo of my grandmother, and I think my grandmother had a sixth sense. I think she was gifted with some things that my mom didn't have, from the stories that my mother told me. And she was very devoted to Santo Niño de Atocha and the Virgen de Guadalupe. And she believed in the spirits, and that you could be frightened and you had to call your spirit back. So she had a lot of indigenous beliefs mixed up with her Catholicism. I didn't get to know her except as a little preschooler. So I always wish that we had made that connection. And on the bed itself, we made the bed, my brothers and I. My mother's real bed was a queen size, of course, but in order to fit the space, we made this little bed. My brother, Henry Cisneros, painted it. My brother, Mario Armando, constructed and painted, stripped it from a chocolate brown bed and made it into what it is. And there are all kinds of objects that are reminiscent of my mother's bedroom, including a little vanity mirror that's in the center. And that really was my mom's. I wrote on it a text that said she didn't really see what she'd done. She only saw what she had not done. And that was the great disappointment of my mother's life, that she had wanted an artistic life. And she took her children to museums every weekend or to the library every Saturday. So I know she's very happy to be in a museum, because this altar, after 2009, it traveled to several other museums, including the Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque. And the real cherry on the cake was it got to go to the Smithsonian. And my mom, I know, was really proud about that. So, here's a devotee of museums, and here she is in a museum. So I know my mom's spirit was very proud. She was also kind of jealous of my fame. I have to admit that. Sorry, Mom. But so I know she's glad that she's got the spotlight here. I put some of her favorite books that were on her bedside when she died on the right-hand side. There are dolls, the doll with the little buttons on it. Those were her political buttons that she liked. And she liked to collect antiques and little statues and little knickknacks from flea markets and secondhand stores. So I tried to include things that were reminiscent of her bedroom, with all the dolls and the little frou-frou statuary, just the kinds of things that she loved. She loved gardening, she loved flowers, and she also liked a piece of cake with coffee. That was, something she looked forward to. So I have a little cup of coffee here with a slice of cake. I also have a snake skin inside of the jar on the right, and a nest on the other, because I tried to think of death as being part of a transition. And my mom's life hasn't ended, but she continues to live. She's very close to me. Her spirit is present in my life now. So that snakeskin was a symbol about that transition, and that nest as a symbol of birth. There are lots of little things that her grandchildren would recognize from her life, including the films and the embroidered pillows and things on the wall that are symbolic of parts of her life. but more than anything, her life was one of gardening, of creation, creating 7 children. She had a couple of miscarriages that she never talked about. I put bowls of water for communication, and flowers everywhere, because my mother loved flowers and loved gardening, and really felt satisfaction later in her life with her garden. All the little vignettes that I created on the walls with the little statues have to do with parts of her life, her noviazgo with my father. And on the right-hand side here, it's about love and sex. And, my mother and father had a very sexy relationship, I think, because you can tell from photos when they were young that they were really in love, even though she didn't like to talk about how sexy my father was. He was. And there's a picture that Diana Solis took of me and my mother, and of me holding my mother. And there's photos of my mother and I when I was a baby, photos of my mother when she was young, and later photos of my mother and my father that my brother Henry Cisneros took. And there's an antique plate, and I put that there simply because my mom, she liked pretty things. She liked things that she would pick up. She was very astute at finding the jewels among the junk when she went to garage sales or secondhand stores. And she was always sculcando, searching for antiques and bringing them home. And so her house was always a mishmash of very fine things, maybe a beautiful French statue, and it would be next to like some little Mexican doll or little Dumbo from Disneyland, all this kind of high rascuache, the mix of high and low, all put together. And I tried to create that with the items that are on the bed. But more than anything, this altar was a distillation. It began as something very small with a bunch of boxes, wooden boxes, and it grew, each time it went from the Mexican Museum to the Hispanic Cultural Center to, I can't remember all the museums it went to, the Smithsonian. It kept getting fine-tuned, and it's made up of so many little tiny pieces, because that's how my mother's house was. It was made up of things she bought at the secondhand stores and things her children and grandchildren gave her, so that it was like all the layers of Tenochtitlan. I tried to create those layering of ages and times, and quiche with high art, with everyday stuff, with folk art, because that's what my mom's room was like. And more than anything, she cherished and savored those last 10 years of her life when she had a room of her own. She would lock the door against the grandchildren and wouldn't let them go in there. No, they touch all my things, she would say. So I know that was very special for her to have a space of her own finally where she could read. And you could see her books are very political, and the buttons that she wore are very political. A woman who's very politically conscious, self-educated, dropped out of high school in the 9th grade, but incredibly well-informed woman politically. And I wanted to, more than anything, honor my mother's creativity, her intelligence, and the person she was before she became my mother. I am a visual artist that's frustrated because I had to allow my writing to take over my visual impulses. And this brought me back to the visual arts by creating this installation. And I had to be very intuitive. It was like writing a poem. I would take some things from my mother's real bedroom, some real little knickknacks and statues that she had. And then I just let myself be open about like, what was it that I wanted to create? I had a few textiles, very few. And I started thinking about like the colors, the cempasúchil orange walls, and the dark as mole eggplant color in the center. And that became, like the principal kind of juxtaposition of colors that I wanted. But I also wanted it to be beautiful because my mother loved beauty. She loved flowers. She loved antiques. And I put some of her dichos on either side of the headboard. And I knew I was going to have a bed. And we had to do a small bed, even though my mother's real bed was bigger. But considering the space, I tried to fill it up with all of what some people would say was clutter. But I would say it's a kind of Baroque, a mom Baroque, when you have all the layers of things that mom puts in her room, along with things people gave her, family, children, grandchildren. And the funny thing is, even though this isn't identical to my mother's room, there's so much that's like my mother's room. It's like a parallel universe with my mom's room, that when my nieces and nephews and brothers come to see this altar, they say, yeah, that's her room. Even though in real life, there was a television set and there was more clutter, but I try to distill it by thinking, what are the things that inspired my mom? And what were the kinds of things that were part of her being when she was a young woman? What was that spirit that I felt leaving her body when I was in the death room? That spirit was so loving and vulnerable and sweet. I couldn't believe that was my mother. And I wanted to represent that person. Hasta me emociona ahorita talking about it because it was so different from the woman I knew. One of the most important things that creating this altar taught me was that it was parallel to when I write. When I write, I am in a state of what I call grace, for lack of a better word, when I open up a channel in my heart and I communicate with the spirits. So the deeper I go into writing and the more I write from a place that is without my ego, I open up a channel and that love is sent to the spirits I'm writing about and the love comes back. I feel that when I write. And the same thing happened with the altar, that I realized the more I focused on the altar, the more that I created it and the more I got in the zone, of just thinking about it, or not even constructing it, just thinking about it, being in that mental state of the altar, I opened up a channel of communication with my mom. And I just could feel her energy and her presence. And that was a blessing. I didn't realize why creating an altar is so important. It's not just about showing others, it's about you connecting with the deceased and the deceased communicating with you. There's an emotional Mobius that's created in the process of installing, creating, thinking, visualizing, of being. It's a meditation with the dead.